Hello and welcome. This is Mouse Gunner, and we're back with some more Kerbal Space Program and Mouse Gunner's Quest. Now, Mouse Gunner's Quest is to build a space plane, kind of like this one you see before you. And the idea is you are going to use this craft to take off from a runway, go through the atmosphere, into space, get a stable orbit, and I would like to have enough fuel left over to then, if I so choose, to be able to leave that orbit and go back down to the surface of Kerbal. But in theory, if we were able to achieve that stable orbit, we could have a refueling craft come by, fuel us back up, and then we could then go on and do more complex missions if we so choose. So the stable orbit is the most important element of this mission. And it is quite a difficult task for a runway-based craft. And as you've seen in the past, we have struggled with this a little bit. In my last video, I showcased the X6. Now the X6 used, it was essentially the last hurrah for the liquid fuel engine-based craft. So craft that used only liquid fuel or liquid fuel and intake air. So what we did with this craft is we are using the Rapier engines, which are a hybrid that use both liquid fuel and intake air or liquid fuel and oxidizer. Now this is the X5, which I built technically before the X6, if you can get the number order of things. And this is kind of what convinced me to get away from the liquid fuel engines. And after we showed the X6 and essentially what the limitations of those liquid fuel engines were, we're going to probably go forward from now on with the hybrid engine, the Rapier engines. Now, with the X5, and I have a variant here, which is the A1, and I'll discuss what the variant is. Typically, I'd show you guys the build from the beginning, but seeing how I already built this craft, I'm just going to discuss the build process. So, as far as cockpits go, I use this cockpit here, the Mark II inline cockpit. There's another variant of this, which has the nose end to it. I like using the inline cockpits because they allow you to build your own nose, kind of like what I did here, which gives you more variability of what you can, slap on the front there, whereas with the one with the nose, you don't have that option open to you. Now, the one with the nose, though, has an advantage here, and this is the advantage of this style of cockpit, is it has a lift rating. Now, this has a lift rating too, but as you can see, this gives you more lift, marginally speaking. But the advantages of this over, for instance, the cockpit we were using before in a lot of our builds is it has a stronger reaction wheel, it can hold more of an electrical charge, it has a more amount of propellant onto it. One downside, though, is that it is heavier, and a lot of that is due to the fact that it now has a crew capacity of 2 as opposed to the 1 we had before. Now, I really don't care about having 2 crew, but if we're going to have that option, why not use it? And it gives our craft a little bit more usability, right? Okay, so other things I did. Now, all of the rest of these essentially sections are in the fuel tank section, and they are going to be the ones with liquid fuel and oxidizer, and that's for our Rapier engines. We're going to need as much of that oxidizer as we can get on our craft. So I used the Mark II bicoupler in the back here to put our 2 Rapier engines on. I used the Mark II rocket fuel fuselage as opposed to the liquid fuel fuselage. So again, they have that oxidizer as opposed to the liquid fuel. And then I had this nose section here, which is the same as this. Now, as you can see with all of these little sections, is they all have a lift rating as well. Okay, and then finally we have the wings as part of our basic structure. Now the wings, if you saw my previous video with the X6, are these wings here, and they have the capacity to have liquid fuel, which I have put in there. So this is the main source of our purely just liquid fuel. So this is what we'll be using for our Rapier engines when we're down in the atmosphere. It's just these tanks that have only liquid fuel. For air intake, we have a couple of these, I don't know what they're called, they're kind of like scoop intakes, radial air intakes on either side, and then we have this shock cone intake on the front of our nose. Now you'll note that I don't have one of those SAS modules. I found out you really don't need it for the SAS, and although it may add a little bit of functionality, I like the option of having this air intake in the front. Now technically speaking, this air intake doesn't give you as much air intake as this air intake does, but I think this air intake, aesthetically wise, goes more with what I would like the craft to look like. Otherwise, I slapped on a couple parachutes. I slapped on a couple of these, if we go to the utility section. So I did some radial mount parachutes. There's two, one on either side. And then I have these 1x6 photo, essentially the, what do I want to say, solar panel little things here. And the reason for that is these Rapier engines do not produce electricity. So the idea is once we get out into space, I would open up these solar panels, and that would give me any electricity I need for longer missions. Because as I said, we only have the electrical charge that we start with, and we have no other way of generating electrical charge. Otherwise, I have the RCS thrusters, like I always put on my craft for directional control in space. And then the last option, and this is the main difference between the X5 and the X5A, is the addition of these air brakes. So if we go to the aerodynamics, you have these air brakes here. Now the air brakes, they will add weight, not a whole lot of weight, it's only what, 0.05. But they allow us to have a little bit of, well, they give us a lift rating, they give us a little bit of controllability, and they also give us the option of air brakes, which, you know, it's not really necessary, but maybe makes it a little bit easier to do a landing. You can slow down quite a bit quicker, and, you know, it gives a little bit of functionality. If we want to use our imagination, and this was some kind of space fighter bomber type thing, then we could use those as kind of like air brakes, like a Stuka, and do a little bit of dive bombing or what have you. Again, that's not a feature that's in this game, but, you know, if you want to use your imagination, that's another use you could have for it. But in any case, I think I've gone over how this craft was built in enough detail, and obviously we have landing gear as well, but otherwise, that's about everything that there is to talk about as far as this craft is concerned. So I think it's about time that we did our launch. Okay, here we are. So we're going to go ahead and slap on our SAS, throttle up, get our fuel up, and let's go ahead and engage. So at this initial stage, we're using our intake air and liquid fuel. Now these engines are a little bit more fuel thirsty than some of those jet engines that we had are, so that is kind of a disadvantage of using these engines. Although I don't know if they're quite as fuel thirsty as the more powerful jet engines when I say that. Okay, we're bringing up our landing gear, and it's time to nose up. Now there's quite a bit of buffeting low in the atmosphere, as we have a lot of wing surface, and we're actually going at quite a speed here, going well over 300 meters per second. But climbing a little bit harder is going to slow us down a little bit. And eventually, once we get up into the upper atmosphere, we're going to have a less air resistance against us, but you can see a lot of that air kind of rushing over the craft there. And we can see that the buffeting has now disappeared. I think it's mostly at really, really high speeds, and we're actually lowering our acceleration here at the moment by nosing up as aggressively as we are, but eventually once we get higher up in the atmosphere we'll have less air resistance and that acceleration will start increasing. Now the one thing I have to remember to do is sometimes, I mean, we still have a bit of air intake air, we are losing it gradually here, and once that gets low enough we'll really start to lose the power of our engines. I do have a hotkey to switch those over manually if I need to, although there is an automatic switching mechanic. And we will try and see if that plays itself out, but I have in other tests seen that it doesn't switch over quite fast enough, and you lose a lot of your acceleration. As a matter of fact, I probably nosed up a little too aggressively. Okay, we're starting to see our acceleration increase now. It's a little bit gradual. There should be kind of a point, though, where it starts really going up. As we burn off more of our fuel, get a little bit lighter. Now, I actually know how this mission is going to end, as far as, you know, what this craft can do, but to not spoil it for you, I'll go ahead and go through this. But we're already at above 17,000 meters, which is quite high, and we're still only using intake air. But I don't know if you can tell that our motors there are starting to kind of get a little bit weaker and weaker, and our acceleration is starting to plummet. So I think I'm going to go ahead and manually switch myself here so we don't lose too much of our acceleration. You can see our acceleration is really going up, so you can see how much of an effect that loss of air and intake air was having on us. But as you can see, the oxidizer there is really burning through very quickly. I think it's probably a point where we can start nosing down a little bit. We've already burned through half of our oxidizer. As a matter of fact, we might not make it out into space, which is something that wouldn't necessarily surprise me too much. It could be that my angle of attack was a little bit wrong with this. Also, I did add on quite a bit of weight from what I had when I did this initial test, which was, you know, not having a lot of the accessories. Matter of fact, I'm not even sure if I had the RCS thrusters. But we also had quite a lot of acceleration. As a matter of fact, I probably could have used that acceleration to try and go for an orbit, but I don't think we would have made it. But it's saying here that it looks like about 53, well, it keeps increasing, but about 53,000 meters is what our expected height is going to be. So I imagine we'll just barely make it out into space. But as you can see here, the problem with this is not that we didn't have the power, is that we didn't have the fuel. We still have lots of liquid fuel, though. Just not enough oxidizer. And I kind of want to, you know, play this out until we get to the extent of our orbit. So I'm just going to keep doing this until we get to the point where we stop dropping. But I don't think we made it out into space quite. I mean, it was very close. But as I said, I added on quite a bit of weight that we didn't have with my initial test, which, by the way, did get out into space. But as you can see, now that we're dropping, so we, as I said, didn't necessarily get quite out into space, we can see that this has, you know, a lot of potential, and maybe if we played with this a little bit, we could get it out into space and maybe even get a stable orbit. So we can see the promise of the X5 with this, and also the promise of what we would, you know, essentially our future and what we're going to try and do. Because this obviously achieves quite a bit more than a lot of our other missions have. So I'm going to go ahead and speed things up. Until we get back down a bit. I always like to slow it down, though, for this part. And when we have enough intake air, I'll probably kick back on the engines here. Oh, actually, they are on. I need to switch them, though. Which you might do automatically. I'm not exactly sure. Guess we'll find out here in a second. Once it's done being on fire. I'm going to start pulling up here. And let's thrust up. Okay, it appears to not be switching over manually, so I'll just do that myself. And we've gained back most of our intake air. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're near any land masses to try and land, so I'm probably just going to end up ditching it in the sea. I might as well just thrust off. There's no real point to that. And we can use our air brakes to slow go down. Which I just love the look of this. Which is one of the reasons why I put it on. It may have hurt our potential of getting out into space, weighing us down a little bit, although I said the weight wasn't much. May have also added a little bit more drag to the overall craft, which is what kind of limited its ability. Okay, so we're getting low in the atmosphere. You can see how much lift we have, because I was just able to start climbing with just lift. Keep slowing down with our air brake. Although we probably can hit our parachutes at this point. I'm probably not going to hit them until it's close to the ground. Probably within a couple 100 meters. Isn't that a beautiful little craft? I really like the way that this looks. Unfortunately, it just doesn't quite perform. And there goes our parachutes. And this is kind of the reason why I didn't want to hit our parachutes too soon, because we're about to hit nose first, which is probably going to break our craft up. Let's hit our... No, actually, it looks like it stayed intact, so our air brake's probably paid off there, really slowing us down. And there we have it. We ditched into... the water with a perfectly intact craft, with the use of both our air brakes and our parachutes. So in any case, I hope you guys have enjoyed this look at the X5 and a continuation of Mouse Gunner's quest. Let's go ahead and revert back to our spaceplane hangar. So as you can see, the potential for the future, more or less what I'm thinking about doing is doing some independent research, essentially off-camera research, seeing maybe if all we did was extend this, give it a little bit more fuel capacity, maybe that would be enough to get it out into space and maybe achieve an orbit. Although there are concerns with the extra weight that you'd also kill off a lot of your speed, and without the speed, you're not going to make it into space, because essentially the more weight you add on, the more power it takes you to get up there. And the more fuel you're burned through to get to the same altitude. So it's possible by slapping on more fuel, all I'll end up doing is actually go lower down in the atmosphere, before I run out of fuel than I did with this mission. So you always have to kind of keep that in mind, that adding on more weight kind of has drastic effects. As I said, I'm not 100% sure on this, but with my initial mission, I might not have even had the RCS stuff, so I wouldn't have had the RCS tank, I wouldn't have had the RCS thrusters, I wouldn't have had the solar panels or the parachute, but that's it. That's all the weight I added on. So, just with that, and the air brakes. So, just with those few things, I didn't make it up into space. Whereas before, I made it up into space by a pretty large margin. As a matter of fact, I think I was up to 100,000 meters, which with this, I think I was like, 54? So you see with that, just a little bit of change of weight, how big of a difference it can make. Of course, as I said, the air brakes could have affected us by adding more drag on or what have you. But in any case, that's pretty much, a look at the X5 and what it can do. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video and a continuation of this series. This is Mouse Gunner, signing out.